My name is Boris Adrian, and I'm not a very technical person, really. I'm a biologist. I do computational research on big biological data sets. And I'm at the University of Cambridge, where I lead a research group. And what we do, essentially, is we look at biology using the various different methods that people use these days to gather large data sets. And what we're trying to do is we try to learn how these different entities, proteins, genomes, DNA, et cetera, all depend on each other. And so you can imagine that that involves an awful lot of machine learning, working with ontologies, et cetera, et cetera. And what we typically have, everything is connected, and we have big, noisy, and often unstructured data sets. And you look at that, and you may immediately think, hey, that's the IoT. Everything is connected, noisy data sets, no structure. And that's when we essentially thought about how we could use our methods a little bit in the context of the IoT. And since a couple of months now, we've been operating as Things Learn. So essentially, the dream would be that one day, some smart algorithm is looking into your household and says, well, there's one clean shirt left. You've used up 98% of your washing powder. It's Wednesday, very late. You've had business meetings in essentially the last 4 Thursdays. There is a need. You need washing powder. But is it appropriate to alarm you? Well, the car is parked just about 20 meters away from a shop, and your last retail activity, according to your credit card, was a few seconds ago. Yes, now it is appropriate to alarm you and to send you a message. So that's the sort of thing that we would like to do. Now, let's for a moment just assume that what I just told you is already reality, because, oh, we can do it, of course. And that this computational inference is a solved problem. It is not, but let's just keep things simple here. Now, however, data plumbing is not, and I'm not a professional programmer. I like to think about data and what I can do with data from a statistical perspective, but I'm not into APIs and protocols and formats, et cetera, et cetera. So just when you think about this short scenario, like, I'd have to interact with Visa, I'd have to interact with some provider that sends my SMS. I have to use the Twitter API. There's JSON, there's XML. My hanger is probably attached to a Raspberry Pi. So very soon, these things can become very complicated, and I don't want that. So this is where I discovered Node-RED. So Node-RED is essentially a rapid prototyping system for the IoT. And the idea is that you model flows. You have some sort of data, you make a decision, and then based on that decision, you either report it or you respond in some way or another. So as I just said, thinking about a good business model or a flow is often difficult enough, and you don't want to get caught up with all the details that are involved with, like, fighting with APIs, et cetera, et cetera. And all we really want is simple data plumbing. And I discovered Node-RED actually following this blog post, because it says it takes the crap out of the IoT, right? So you can really outsource all the annoying bits of the IoT to Node-RED and then concentrate on what you really want to achieve. So what is Node-RED? It's a Node.js-based web service that you can run on very much any platform. So I have it on all the Raspberry Pis in the house. I have it on this Mac. I run it in the cloud. And the beauty of it is that essentially it's open source. You can easily delve into that code and extend Node-RED by all the functionalities that you desire. And there are even a couple of kind of like branched off programs now. One's called NodeBlue, as far as I'm aware. I'm not using that. But essentially, it gives you all these possibilities for extensibility. So Node essentially is, or Node.js is essentially just some sort of a JavaScript framework. So it also provides you with a very low entry point. You don't have to be a super duper Java programmer. It is fairly simple. It is very straightforward. So, however, you don't need to code. Node-RED presents you with a graphical user interface, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a few minutes. So all you do is you push around these nodes that all stand for a certain functionality, and you link them up with each other using these lines, and you create a flow. It's as simple as that. Node-RED comes with a large library of complementary modules. So upon the first installation, you already have nodes that you can use, for example, to listen to a Twitter feed. You can store information into databases. You can even use the GPIO pins on a Raspberry Pi. And that enables everyone really to make IoT developments, even if you're not a top programmer. You can listen to Twitter and you can make a light blink, and all it takes is wiring that up. Another nice thing is that you can share your flows because they're just JSON strings. So all that JavaScript that is generated while you are drawing your flow in Node-RED can be communicated as a JSON string. You can simply paste that into an email and send it to somebody. They can re-import it into their Node-RED and use it straight away. So they call this social development. I'm not sure how social it is to send somebody your code, but essentially there is a potential to easily exchange what you've created. And people are already doing this. So on the Node-RED website, there's already a subsection, the flow library, where people add their latest creations. And you can find things like, notify me if your public IP address changes. I've submitted one recently where I interact with a weather shield for the Raspberry Pi. And there's an ever-growing list, and people have already submitted flows that work with various pieces of hardware, and that's already nice. So that brings me to my first demo, and I guess there's nothing better than a hello world if one's talking to probably an audience of programmers. Yeah, I even typed it, just in case. So by default, when you start up the Node-RED web service on your machine, it would try to locate a flow file that's typically called by your latest network name. And as I've been traveling recently, I just made a default JSON, which I'm going to load. And yep, I just started Node-RED, so it's nothing too spectacular at the moment. A couple of messages really. Can't find certain modules, which is fine because that's not a Raspberry Pi, for example, and I don't need to parse XML. If I wanted to, I could easily use all the power that's there for Node.js and go to the npm.js, which is a repository for further Node modules, and simply install them from the command line. So now I'm going into my web browser, and I start Node-RED on my local machine. That's what it looks like. So I was expecting a pointy stick. Unfortunately, I don't have one. I may have to jump at some stage. So what you see here on that side is a panel with all of the available nodes that people have created or that are coming with your original installation of Node-RED. So you have input nodes. So there's the inject node, for example, that I'm going to show you in a second, where you can manually inject a message. You can listen to MQTT feeds. You can listen to your HTTP port. Then there are output nodes. So we have a debug node that essentially just displays information then on this panel here. You can send emails, you can do Twittery stuff. So there's an awful lot of things. This is really where the power comes. It's the functions section. And essentially, that provides you with a code editor where you can say, well, now there's some sort of data coming into my node that I will create. And I'm going to write what that node is going to do. If it's just something simple, like you would usually probably solve with a switch statement, you don't even have to code that. There is a node for that already. If it's slightly more complicated, then you just write normal JavaScript. So I told you I was just going to do a hello world. I'm going to do this here. I'm going to take an inject node. And what you can see here now is essentially in the info box, you already see all the information that's associated with that particular object, with that particular node, and a little bit of a help text. Of course, in that case, it's fairly simple. You're just going to inject a string in a moment. In other cases, that help text may be a little bit longer. And we're going to take a debug node, which will hopefully then in a second give us some sort of output. So now I connect up the inject node and the debug node. So here is my input, there's my output. There's nothing I really need to do about the output information. Here, my inject node, I say I'd like to inject a payload, and that's hello world. I go to my debug window. Now I deploy the flow. Okay, so at the moment, there's no code running. It's all still in the drawing up stage. But now I deploy my node. I successfully deployed it. And now if I press the button, which is just really a manual injection of this message, it shows up over here. Now I don't expect any applause for that, but that's essentially as simple as Node-RED is. Okay, back to here. So I was already using the term message. So just to provide you with a cross-section. So typically a Node-RED message that you send between two different nodes has a topic and a payload. And I say the similarity is probably not quite unintentional when you think about MQTT. And in fact, there are many flows that I'm using for my personal tinkering where essentially I'm just passing around MQTT messages from node to node. However, these messages are really just JavaScript objects, and you can easily put other stuff into them as well and make them quite complex and even transport complex data structures. So I'll give you more about messaging. So what we have here, for example, is an example where you can aggregate information from different nodes and funnel them into a single recipient. So in that case, we have a single debug node that you can feed with the red, green, orange, and blue inject nodes. And the debug node doesn't really care where a message is coming from. It just operates on that. So that's simple, okay? Now, as I told you, for more complicated cases, you might even have two different inputs and two different outputs. So here in that case, I want a fast message. So I click here. I got the fast message. You can see that. There was very little delay between me clicking and that message occurring. However, I could also want a slower message. Now you can see that here in the topic of my message, that's very small and faint here, it says a fast message. I'm testing in here. I'm testing in here if the topic contains fast or slow. okay? And that I use then to pipe information that's coming from here to the delay node, 5 seconds, and there it occurred. So that is very simple decision making, and at this stage you don't have to be a programmer to come up with that condition, how you want to pipe your flow. And a third example. Now, that's actually copy-pasted from the Node-RED webpage. And I didn't know whether I was going to have internet connectivity here or not, because that seems to be a curse for everyone who's presenting Node-RED, that the internet breaks down at some stage. So this is just a real screenshot. But that's one of these JSON strings that you can use to share your flow. So I copy-pasted that piece of information into Node-RED. So in reality, what I would do is go into here, and I'd say import from clipboard, just paste in the JSON string, and what would come out is this what I have here. And actually, it's been running in the background. You may have realized that for a while already. So there is this website here from the National Grid in the UK, where they provide you with some information about power consumption and power distribution in the UK. And all I know is that essentially frequency up there has to be, or should ideally be, above 50 hertz to give you proper electricity. If it's less, that's probably not ideal. And so what this flow here does, essentially, every 5 minutes, so this is not me pushing the button manually, this is now essentially a time trigger. Every 5 minutes, I essentially consult that website. I just retrieve that page, and this is all that I'm doing with this node here. And again, I mean, just imagine, like, somebody who does not know how to program. You just give it a web page, and you get back the HTML, and you don't have to fiddle around with, like, you don't probably even have to know what get means, right? So that's all fairly nice. So then here, there's a function node, and that was all contained in that big JSON string that I imported in the beginning. And what we have here is just a little bit of parsing, and we make a decision. And the decision is, are we still okay? If our frequency is greater than 50 hertz, we're fine. If it's not, we're not fine. So this is where this node here produces two different messages. Now, we don't have to specifically say that we want to have two of these output nodes. We just say, like, there's message 1, message 2, and automatically that function node will create these output nodules. So here what we have is now, we want to show the data, which is essentially what we had here. Oh yeah, you can see my mouse cursor, that's great. So that's the information that we extracted from this web page. And here is essentially that second message that we created dynamically in the code, where we just want to have a Boolean value, are we okay or not. And if I was now a really paranoid person, I could say, well, if we are not okay, I will simply just send myself an email, and I would insert an email address here, and then it's finished. There are a couple of other scenarios where Node-RED can come in really handy. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for the IoT, but just some things that are very convenient. So for example, I have a couple of headless Raspberry Pis running in my house, and very often I just don't know what IP address they've got. So what runs on these machines essentially is a Node-RED flow that on startup really just injects a Unix command into an exec node. So here I do an ifconfig and I just grab my inet that goes into more or less a node which is not even fully configured, but it takes the command that's being injected, okay? And what I get here then is the appropriate information. I can pipe out stodout, I can have stder, and essentially I can even have a third output here, which would be the error code that's being returned. And I think that makes Node-RED quite a powerful utility for many things that you might be doing on an everyday basis, where probably in other cases you would write a shell script, but if you can do it in Node-RED and immediately have connectivity to Twitter and mail, that can be quite good. Yes. So I've been a big Node-RED fan for a while, and of course Node-RED is a tool for the IoT. And what I always missed really is to understand how to use Node-RED with all of these IoT platforms that are out there. So there's like Carrots and everything, and iHub and Exercise, and I mean, you name it. And so at some stage, I decided for myself I wanted to gain an overview about all these different IoT platforms that were out there. And I probably missed half of them, or probably I missed 70% of them. But at least I looked at that set here, and for each of those, I figured out how to do it the Node-RED way. So I called this the Node-RED interoperability test. And essentially, my test scenario back in the day was a Raspberry Pi was monitoring the weather in my living room using one of these AirPi shields. Normally, I just take those values coming from the AirPi shield, make a very simple HTML page, and show this on a wireless display in the house. But now for the interoperability test, I piped this information through all sorts of function nodes and then published information either using MQTT to platforms that supported that standard or using RESTful APIs. And in that interoperability document, you can then see, for example, if you wanted to publish something to Xively, that's the sort of code you would have to write so that AirPi shield delivers some 10 different parameters, and you need to essentially collate a couple of data points because there's a limit on the number of API calls you can, or MQTT submissions you can do per unit of time when you're a non-paying customer on Xively. So this is what the code does. And then in sort of like pink, these are the MQTT settings that you would have to use. And yeah, here we go. This is then how the temperature looks on Xively. And this is really what showed to me that Node-RED is an ideal entry point, probably not only for industry customers, but also for hobbyists who like to get involved in the IoT and want to store their own information. Just to show you how powerful Node-RED really is and how extensible, I've had an interest in data visualization for a while, and here in this flow, for example, I trawl a Hypercat catalog for information that certain street lamps that are mounted in the car park of ARM in Cambridge, and then visualize that information. And what you can do is just simply include libraries, either a Google library to show stuff on Google Maps, or here a different sort of other mapping library, and simply use those JavaScript objects that these people create and create powerful visualizations and websites using Node-RED. Now, everyone has to be converted, and the younger the better. So I also made a little bit of a tool for my children so they can use Node-RED, send MQTT messages to Minecraft. So essentially what we have here is inject buttons that dictate the movement of the person in the Minecraft world. These get sent to a Mosquito broker, and then there's just a little bit of Python running in the background on the Raspberry Pi that then translate these MQTT messages into movements of the Minecraft person. So I think it's also a great educational tool because, of course, they think, well, you know, I don't want to press 50 times forward. Is there something like a loop? And of course there is. And then even younger people, children, can essentially start wiring up flows. So you might ask, that's all nice and great, but what if there is just not the right sort of node for me? I have a particular piece of hardware. I want to query a particular website and I can't get to grips with it just using the normal HTTP input node that's provided. Well, write your own. Many people do that, and quite fortunately, these days, you can just go to GitHub and download a repository of nodes that people have custom created for Node-RED. And just to give you a couple of examples, what people have submitted already, a swear filter to essentially block out messages that have certain words in them. And I mean, I don't know why the fuck people would use that, but you know, it's there. There are various nodes for the interaction with particular pieces of hardware. So quite popular are these Wemo modules, which are just power sockets that you can switch off by radio, and there is a node for that. And this is really one that I really like. It looks at your location and determines the sunset time, so you can essentially appropriately switch on lights, etc. Now they're now moving to store novel nodes also on NPM, which is the repository for Node.js modules. So you can just go to you can just use the tools that you are used to as a Node.js programmer and install these novel modules into your directories, and then you're all set. Everything, for example, have now submitted a dedicated submission node for pumping data into their platform, so you don't have to do it the hackish way. So what is a node? A node essentially is a pair of an HTML file and a JavaScript file. So here, sample HTML and sample JS would do the job. And I'm going to show you in a second what's in them. In general, that's a big disadvantage. No mouse cursor, no pointer. In your Node-RED folder on brilliant. Thank you. So essentially on very much every platform under your Node-RED, you have a nodes directory, and I've expanded this here just to show you that these are usually nicely ordered into various topics like, social media interaction, hardware analysis, et cetera. These are my default flows that, depending on where my machine was in the network, essentially get called different ways. Web is a directory which you would use to essentially store templates and such for when you create websites for the use with Node-RED. The credentials are quite important, so are the settings, because this is where you keep information on how to log in to Twitter, for example, et cetera. You don't want to share this all the time with your flows. And yeah, I guess the core machinery really sits in here and in here. And I never touch those. It's probably for a reason. So when you look into these two files I just mentioned, the HTML file and the JS file, let's look at the HTML first. So we have a node which is called lowercase. And all it does, essentially, it takes an incoming message and it translates whatever string into the lowercase version of that string. It's a fairly simple one. It's a function node. It has one input, it has one output, and you may have realized that all these nodes have an icon, and there's a library of icons that you can call up with essentially file 1, file 2, file 3, file 4, et cetera. There is a label. So although it's the lowercase node, you can call that whatever you want within your flow, so you can easily identify it. And here, essentially, it defines an input field. If you wanted to change that name, you don't have to. But also, there's going to be a default, which is name. And then here we have the help text that would be displayed in that panel on the other side of the node. The JavaScript code itself is even more straightforward, as you would expect. And essentially, the magic happens here. So on input, the new message payload is going to be the lowercase version of the payload that you pumped in. And you send, so you return that message. So really, with about 20 lines of JavaScript and a little bit of HTML, you get away creating your own little nodes. So until about probably 3 months ago, I thought that Node-RED is great, but it will always remain a toy for the Raspberry Pi. Until IBM took Node-RED and ported it into their platform, Bluemix. So Bluemix is platform as a service, and when you log in, you can choose from different boilerplates that you can use to initiate your projects. One of the boilerplates here is the Node-RED starter, and it really just creates an instance that you can immediately start to play with. You can also then marry your Node-RED instance to all sorts of other services that run in the cloud as well. So you could connect it to a NoSQL database. You could link it to a Mongo database, use the IBM analytics tools, and they will essentially occur as valid identifiers if you choose the appropriate node. So if you choose a database node, for example, it would then know which database you want to use out of those that you've selected previously. So this is what it looks like. So here is a flow that I've created just for the purpose of this conference. Doesn't look very spectacular. Here you can identify it here. It's iotconf.mybluemix.net. So essentially, I could use whatever URL I want and just do some rerouting. but this is how I can publicly make my flow visible and available. And then this is what it is going to show you. So hold on, this is a live demo again. So this is now the Node-RED flow on Bluemix, and I've been very naughty here. This is not password protected at the moment, so if you want to screw me up, you can just log onto that website and delete stuff randomly. I'm going to take it off as soon as this presentation is over. So what this flow does is I wait for an HTTP request, I listen to Twitter, and I listen to Twitter for various keywords like IoT, IoTconf, me, Nick, Node-RED, and I do a little bit of counting. So essentially, the tweets come in, and essentially the keywords that I'm looking after, they are going to be in the payload. So essentially, the topic is the person who tweeted, and the tweet itself is in the payload. And then I just do very, very simple counting. And what's important is that I pump out a couple of variables, which then I can use here in some very simple, in a very simple mustache format, as content of my web page. And yeah, here we go. Takes a second. So until last night, that flow was crapping out every 2 days or so because of some memory issue that's now been fixed. But essentially, over the last sort of 22 hours, we've had nearly 5,000 tweets containing, I guess, mostly IoT, 10 mentions of Node-RED, 37 mentions of me. Now, I cheated Nick because turns out that his Twitter handle actually is a lowercase, and I was only looking for an uppercase. And yeah, IoTconf seemed to be quite popular. And yeah, so that's all happening in the cloud, and I don't need to take care of any machines. And if I wanted to screen for 20,000 different Twitter handles and words, it would all be possible. I just need to buy a little bit more compute power. And oops. Yes. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and please do ask me questions. I'm not the person who created Node-RED, so it's those two guys who unfortunately can't be here today. But yeah, I've been a fanatic user ever since the early versions, and well, maybe you will use it too. So now go invent. Thanks very much.